Bonjour, Madame la vice-rectrice, Monsieur le directeur, le président de l'Institut de recherche en sciences psychologiques, Madame la doyenne, cher Proximus, cher Yann, chers collègues, amis, famille. Plus cette soirée approchait, plus je prenais le plaisir à vous parler et plus je me suis rendu compte de l'honneur que c'est d'être celle qui couvre la chère Frankie. Comme Manu l'a souligné tout à l'heure, il existe une coopération étroite entre l'UCL et l'Université de Gand et je ferai de mon mieux pour que ces liens étroits soient encore plus forts. Nous partageons entre autres les préoccupations concernant le nombre croissant d'étudiants qui exercent une pression sur nos programmes de psychologie. Et j'ai hâte à travailler avec Jean, Yann et ses collègues. Yann, nous avons passé tant de merveilleuses années à Gand. J'ai tellement appris de toi. Cela ressortira certainement de ce que je dirai ce soir. Donc, quand je dis des bêtises, tu es le seul à blâmer. Donc, je suis vraiment très reconnaissante à la Fondation Frankie et au conseil de l'université et de la faculté pour cet honneur. Beaucoup avaient espéré être ici de manière virtuelle. Malheureusement, cela s'est avéré impossible, mais différé n'est pas perdu. Je voudrais donc bien dire quelques mots à ceux qui écouteront cette séance plus tard. Dear colleagues, and especially all my past and present PhD students, preparing for this evening was a real trip down to memory lane. And what a powerful journey it was, full of heartwarming moments and stories that have been the joy of my professional life. I thank each of you from the bottom of my heart. It has touched me so many times what a privilege it has been to collaborate on all these fascinating projects. Although I cannot tell everything, you will hear in this lecture how much I learned from each of you. Lieve vrienden, ook dank voor jullie vriendschap en ook jullie zullen in deze lezing echo's horen. En vooral mijn lieve familie. Ik heb het altijd geweten, maar nu, ik heb het nog zelden zo goed gevoeld hoe onbelangrijk en wat een voorrecht het is om in een warme familie te mogen leven. Deze lezing is een eerbetoon aan mijn warme, diverse familie. Oh. This is not working. This. No, it's this one. Yeah. No. Okay, so this is the title of my lecture, and this was meant when I said all those past and present PhD students. You see there are a lot of them, all the co-authors. Thank you very much. Okay, before I get into tonight's story, let me give you a quick rundown of what to expect. I will soon be talking about Frank Sinatra, then suburbia, then Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, then blood. Blood, it will be a lot of blood. It will be a bloody story. After all, it's the tale of the hunter. And of course, lions. In the beginning is how all stories begin. Well, in the beginning there was Robert Heindy and his dialectical framework of interactions and relationship within context. We're talking about the 1970s, really once upon a time. I was a toddler when Robert Heindy described a diachronic perspective model in which he placed behavior in context. As behavioral scientists, we psychologists are interested in explaining, predicting, and even changing behavior. For example, by looking at what is happening within individuals. Think of personality, temperament, genes, learning ability, emotion regulation, executive functions, and much, much more. With its wealth of increasingly accurate theories and methods, psychology as a science has made tremendous progress in explaining behavior. I have always been particularly fascinated by the world between individuals, because much of our behavior takes place in interaction with one another. We spend about 70% of our time interacting. Our interactions, our interpersonal influence is down to context for our behavior, so to speak. Interactions do not necessarily have to be verbal or intentional. Imagine, for instance, that you wave enthusiastically to someone at the across the street, at an acquaintance across the street, and the other person does not wave back. Chances are that this event will occupy you. It can make you think, did he not see me? Did he not want to see me? Is he angry with me? Do I owe him money? Was I drunk the last time I saw him? Even if the other person did nothing at all, the interaction will still have an impact on you. It shows that how we interact is closely related to who we are. Our group has done a lot of interesting research on this in recent years. For example, on empathy, on conflict, on support, attachment, stress, coping, unwanted pursuit, guilt and shame, violence, sexual desire, quality of life, and a lot more. But interactions, in turn, take place in the context of relationships. In the waving example, the context was a weak tie. But if the other person had been a family member, or a lover, or a colleague, or a friend, the impact would certainly have been different. Relationships are more than the sum of interactions, for they continue to exist even when people are not together or not interacting. And they, in turn, are not islands, but exist in the context of groups with different social stratification and associated power dynamics and agency. And finally, society is the context in which these groups exist. Although in the course of our work, we seem to have moved more and more from the micro to the meso to the macro level in Heindi's model, this was certainly not a linear process. Rather, it was a back and forth diachronic perspective with a focus on families, interactions in families, and also families in groups and society. Families are absolutely intriguing because we are produced, located, supported, and oppressed in families. We cannot escape them. It is not easy to give a definition. Families are a fluid and ambiguous concept, construed by their members and thus possibly changing from person to person and from time to time. However constructed, they are the way we organize our sexual, reproductive, economic, and intimate lives. All levels of Heindi's model are relevant when studying families. Tonight's focus is on analyzing families as constructions of reality, how family members shape their relationships to each other and their relationship to the world, and how the world influences families. So I will mainly talk about the upper part of Heindi's model. Along with the interest in interactions, relationships, groups, and society came our interest in the narrative turn. This primarily refers to the social relational function of stories, how they contribute to cultural socialization and identity formation. I like the metaphor that people are storytellers, that our lives unfold while we are telling them. There are the grand narratives that we pass down from generation to generation, and there are the little stories we tell each other every day. Here and now, for instance, we tell the story of this inaugural lecture. The grand narrative is that of academia. Because we all have been socialized in this grand narrative, we don't start singing or dancing or picking our noses. The story goes that I'm giving a meaningful lecture, coherent, that I have been working on for quite some time, and you are listening willingly until I finish. As such, the grand narrative of academia allows us to understand the situation here and now and to meaningfully participate in this interaction, in our relationship, in our group. But this evening does not coincide with the grand narrative, because we do not simply undergoing. On the contrary, Marianne has COVID and Pierre has to replace Marianne, it will replace Jan, and the people in Ghent were thinking of following online, and this is also not the case. So there are all kinds of things that are not part of this grand narrative and that make this into a unique event. We are making our little story here and now, and we do this inaugural lecture together. We talk ourselves into this lecture. And remember, the talking does not necessarily have to be verbal or intentional. Every frown, smile, sigh, nod or word or photo contributes to the unique story of this evening. This is how we are socialized and form our identity. We talk our way in and out relationships, in and out groups, in and out society, in and out this inaugural lecture. As such, stories enable us to stay meaningful in the world, or not, because stories can both include and exclude. Those who are not part of the story or the storytelling do not learn the social rules, do not get socialized, and are not part of relationships, groups, or society. Think, for instance, of women and old boys networks, newcomers or outsiders in the dominant culture, people in poverty, or, the topic of tonight, families that deviate from the standard. It makes a substantial difference whether you are in or out the story, whether you can or cannot participate in the storytelling. And that brings me to intersectionality. For as our research moved further away from the individual in Heidi's model, we became more aware that not everyone can just talk their way in or out everything. It is not that simple. There are clearly issues of agency and power that go beyond the individual. Not everyone can participate in just any story, not even in this story of the inaugural lecture. The more one deviates from the grand narrative, the more one's own little story is marginalized, and the more barriers one has to overcome to get one's own story told. So if you are not white, not male, not straight, not educated, not middle class, and especially if you are a combination of these, then you are discourse dependent. Intersectionality offered us a critical analysis of how women, men, and children in different types of families experience privilege and oppression in private and public contexts on the basis of their gender, their race, social class, sexual and gender orientation, nationality, disability, or other forms of stratification. It is primarily about social inequality and social justice, or the problem of equality and difference and its relationship to power. It is about the interaction between social location and systems of privilege and oppression embedded in institutions, policies, practices, and culture. I would like to refer to my colleagues in social work at Ghent, who are doing a lot of interesting work on this. For us family researchers, this means studying how behavior, especially doing family and talking family, is related to social systems that institutionalize the experience of inequality for specific groups. Together, these three frameworks, Heidi's model, the narrative turn, and intersectionality, form the framework of our research. Of course, there's only one way of telling the story, and many other ways of seeing it are possible. But for tonight, I felt that this was a story that fits. This is also how I came up to the overarching title of this Frankie lecture series, Untalking Family in Discourse-Dependent Families. But first, Frank Sinatra. Don't panic, I'm not going to sing or dance after all. When you ask people for an epitaph that suits them, a saying for their graph, the most common response is, I did it my way. That, I think, is an interesting paradox in itself, that everyone thinks they did it differently from everyone else. Because If you look at our lives a little from a distance, we basically do all the same. We go to school, get a degree, then get a job, we marry or move in together, have children, build a house, get divorced and marry again. And eventually, we retire and die. Let's call this grand narrative suburbia. In Dutch, we call it huisje, tuintje, boompje. The I did it my way paradox points to the difference in agency between, on the one hand, the suburbia grand narrative and the accompanying social expectations and standards to which people are subjected to, and on the other hand, the variations on that theme that emerge from the little stories that people do and talk every day. Let's take a look at them from a bit closer. Grand narratives are strongly culturally embedded and go hand in hand with societal expectations and standards. Think about suburbia, but also about happily ever after, the marriage plot, the blood is thicker than water narrative, with nuclear families as the cornerstone of society, the neoliberal American dream, or the legend of the genius absent-minded professor. They inspire us for life, love, and death. Our colleagues from the Cultural and Education Research Group at Ghent have done a lot of very interesting work on this. It is, for instance, convincingly documented that our thinking on relationships is influenced by the happily ever after image of the heterosexual romantic relationship that has been prominent in the literature for the last 250 years. The romantic plot of the fairy tale marriage, starring blood ties, nuclear families, heteronormativity, and the associated stereotypical gender roles, think tough men, emotional women, and wicked stepmothers, influences what we consider normal, right or wrong, and successful or unsuccessful. And also our identities, how I want to be seen, how I fear to be seen. The ground narratives we primarily undergo. There are the world-to-person stories. We saw an example of the impact of such a grand narrative when we evaluated a compulsory pre-abortion consultation in Flanders. Almost 1,000 women received a questionnaire immediately prior to this consultation and afterwards to gauge their thoughts, feelings, and expectations. What we found was that beforehand, the women were very determined about having their abortion, but also anxious and worried about a consultation. Afterwards, they were surprisingly positive. This was mainly because their fear of being judged by the counselor proved unjustified. After all, on the basis of the social expectations of the grand narrative that the unwanted pregnancy was their own fault, they had expected a conviction. They were relieved when the counselor turned out not to be judgmental. Grand narratives influence our lives, but no life coincides with them. Our research with women waiting for their abortion made this also very clear. They were decisive about the abortion, averse to the grand narrative, and sure that they would go ahead even if they feared condemnation. Little stories are told in everyday interactions between family members. As such, all family members actively shape, do, and talk the unique reality of their family. Family identity is created by doing. We say doing family, just as we talk about doing gender. And because storytelling is one way of doing family, we talk also about talking family, referring to the everyday talking that people do to construct and maintain their family relationships. Families define and legitimate their family identity by creating family ties, negotiating family boundaries, assigning rights, responsibilities, and roles to each family member as they talk to one another, to outsiders, and to society. Little stories are the person-to-world stories. And both grand narratives and little stories are important in understanding identity, and people navigate them between them all the time. Both lenses in isolation present only a partial and incomplete picture of the agency direction of fit between person and world. Like the woman in the waiting room for their abortion, we all at some point feel the social expectations and standards of one or another grand narrative. As an academic, as a partner, as a parent, as a son, as a daughter, as a neighbor, friend, sibling, colleague, teacher, client, or whatever. Because the impact of grand narratives cannot be underestimated, it's absolutely crucial to be critical of the status quo that they serve, both in privilege and oppression. For while we all know the sense of agency that comes from our little story, like the determination of the woman waiting for an abortion, that agency depends to a large extent on how far we are socially located from the plot of the grand narrative. The dynamics between the grand narrative and the little stories are strongly dependent on where families are socially located. That is why we cannot but pay attention to social inequality. Our research then focuses on how social expectations and mythical standards of the grand family narratives impact everyday little family discourses. What the impact is on the family life and how families deal with them. Because we are committed to social justice, we privilege little stories of families who are discursive dependent and socially located outside the plot of the grand narratives. Our hypothesis is that the further families are socially distanced from the grand narrative and its accompanying social expectations and standards, the more their little stories will be marginalized, and the harder it is for them to get their little story told. The resulting dialectical tension is then expected to be reflected in their everyday doing family and talking family. We further expect that this will be evident from the way in which family members tell their little stories, because little stories differ from grand narrative in how they are organized. Grand narratives have a good story to tell. They have a linear, temporal, and causal organization, a beginning, a plot, and usually a happy ending, and a certain constant moral stance. Little stories, on the other hand, are rather muddled and fragmented. The narrators often jump from one storyline to another, and in an ongoing story full of ambivalent statements, inconsistencies, and emotional clashes. Narrators often contradict themselves. And these contradictions are an interesting subject of research exactly because we expect them to correspond to the degree of relational work family members have to do talking family. Little stories are told in the context of the grand narrative, and inconsistencies are argued to be especially apparent in discourse-dependent families because, given that they are socially distanced from the grand narrative, they have to reinvent their concept and to suit their family. Remember behind this model and the importance of context. Behavior is context dependent, and so behavior cannot be expected to be stable from one context to another. Think of the environmentally conscious smoker, or the humanist trader, or the financial risk taker who is afraid of physical risks, the assertive friend who does not dare to face his mother when she starts asking about his love life, or the academic soap addict. Consistency goes hand in hand with context. It is not the individual who should be questioned, but the context that creates all kinds of inequality. In the grand narrative, if the grand narrative fits, so does its logic and structure. However, if the little story falls outside the dominant paradigm and it's marginalized, it is much harder to tell, especially if the narrator is in a weak social position. So I would like to borrow Nietzsche's formula in Beyond Good and Evil. Contradictions are a sign of health. Everything absolute belongs to pathology. So it is not that we do not expect family members to think carefully about the questions and answer them in the same thoughtfulness. On the contrary, inconsistencies have more to do with the context than with the individual. Although family members will use post hoc constructions that are inevitably influenced by the tendency to present themselves in a logical way, we do expect inconsistencies in their stories, which will increase as the dialectical tension between the grand narrative and the little story increases. So our focus is on how discourse-dependent families actually live, not on how they are supposed to live. This is exactly why our research questions revolve around inconsistencies in the everyday discourses, lived experiences, and little stories of discourse-dependent families. How they do family, how they talk family. By doing so, we acknowledge that families do not develop on their own in a social vacuum, but are constantly exposed to the influence of ground narratives and their social expectations and standards. That contributes to the complexity they experience when doing family, but may also yield opportunity to reinvent the family identity in a uniquely suitable fashion, which in turn points to the agency that comes from these little stories, culminating in the conviction we all share: I did it my way. So if you are still with me in the story, and I profoundly hope you are, this may all sound very logical, actually more logical than it actually is. After all, research too cannot escape the influence of the ground narratives, and there is always the danger that research will serve the status quo and thus get in the way of social justice itself. In order to answer the research questions, our designs had to meet the expectations of our three frameworks, and this forced us to be very critical of the effects of our research methods, design, and results. To achieve social innovation, our research always focused on discourse-dependent families as agents in context. That is, through anti-categorical designs, focusing on talking family in interaction, using mixed methods, and interdisciplinary research involving different stakeholders. This resulted in a wide range of mostly complex and very comprehensive studies. More than once, our doing science deviated in several respects from the prevailing expectations and standards associated with the ground narrative of science. One distinctive feature of our studies is the use of anti-categorical designs. The study of marginalized stories requires such a design to capture flexibility and acknowledge different and fluent ways of doing and talking family. Reviewers and funding agencies, however, often insisted that we compare discursive families with other families to find out exactly what the difference is. We consistently refused doing so, because the results completely depend on who you compare with whom. And any comparison of families is normative because it is based on the assumption of what a control or a normal or a healthy family would be. Such a deficit-based research would serve the status quo, because what exactly does such a control, normal, healthy family look like? Chances are it will be a cisgender, heterosexual, Eurocentric, middle-class family, and not a single-parent, foster, disabled, adoptive, divorced, donor-conceived, sexual minority, gender non-conform, interracial, poor, ethnic minority, or blended one. However, social justice requires a focus on the structure and dynamics that force discourse-dependent families into disadvantaged social location, and in no way a comparison with families that conform to the narrow social expectations and mythical standards of the ground narrative. And equally important, families that are in a socially privileged location can tell nothing about the relational work that is needed to deal with the dialectical tensions between the ground narrative and their own little story. The ground narratives have evolved themselves thanks to the greater visibility and the growing number of diverse family identities and movements such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the LGBTQIA+. In Belgium, family diversity is also enshrined in legislation, for instance on abortion, cohabitation, same-sex marriages, adoption, no-fault divorce, mediation, and recently also transgender issues. Yet it remains necessary to be vigilant and critical of the effect of the ground narrative and continually assess where families are socially located that are marginalized or oppressed by them. To give only one example, there is remarkably little research on fathers and stepfathers. No doubt this has to do with the social expectations and standards that mothers have a much more important role in parenting, and stepmothers are therefore more relevant to study. All of our studies deal with families that are discursive dependent in one way or another. Some were population-based surveys with thousands of respondents where stratification or purposeful sampling, for example, of sexual or ethnic minorities, ensures that families in a disadvantaged social location are included. Others involved limited numbers, up to only 6, for instance, from very specific groups. The range of discourse-dependent families we have studied so far included ex-partners, families going through divorce with a focus on children, blended families with a focus on fathers and stepfathers, adoptive families, families with children with disabilities, gender non-conform individuals, gay and lesbian couples, families conceived through gamete donation, donors, ethnic minority families, transgender, men and their cisgender partner, and I might well forget a few. Our research questions require us to approach sometimes families, sometimes couples, sometimes individuals. Although we have used a range of methods, 3 stand out. First, the round-robin designs, in which all family members report on all other family members. They can take into account the multi-actor setting of families and allow us to capture the relevant importance of individual relational and, in some cases, also family characteristics. Second, the interdisciplinary projects that Pierre also already mentioned, with colleagues from family law, sexology, bioethics, sociology, and medicine. In co-creation with various stakeholders, that is very important because no social problem can be solved from one discipline. Joining forces from academia, civil society, and government is a way to address social justice as a shared challenge through structured and focused interaction where each contributes and uses their own expertise, skills, knowledge, and networks. And third, the qualitative methods. Typically semi-structured interviews analyzed through interpretative phenomenology. These are well suited to capture the lived experience and the stories, the doing family and the talking family. Here too, we had difficulty convincing funding agencies of the value of such results. I remember the sentence that finally convinced one such agency. As we were saying, we are looking for unique, marginalized stories. If we hear the same story twice, it's once too much. Because little stories are ongoing and full of contradictions, they are not easy to study and have not always received the scientific attention they deserve. They especially serve a social connecting role, such as maintaining the family through everyday talking family and interaction. It is not so much the content as the context that makes them interesting. They are, in essence, they are the essence of feeling like a family, which lies in ordinary, everyday activities, such as having a meal together, or playing, watching television, or participating in family storytelling, and thus providing or receiving mundane updates of the main family storylines. Every story is meant to do something, doing family, talking family, reassuring, acknowledging, nurturing, enjoining, rejecting, dominating, encouraging, or just feeling an awkward silence. And because the social function of communication is more often associated with women, the marginalized position of little stories in science has also been interpreted in a feminist way. Nowadays, luckily, there is more attention for the social connecting role of communication. It's no longer dismissed as inferior. However, it remains important to be sensitive for any unintended negative side effect of the analysis of talking family, including that a focus on apparent contradictions might lead us to expect the individual or the family to adapt. On the contrary, we must always take the context into account. Here lies a responsibility for us researchers to keep the focus of research on inequality and stratification. And then finally, also the research context itself, the grand narrative of doing science, influenced the little stories we studied. In many cases, the questions in our interviews or questionnaires themselves seem to challenge the parents and children in the sense that they brought to the fore issues that hardly ever surfaced in their daily lives. In donor-conceived families, for instance, participants could realize during the research that their family had been created through a donor conception, whereas this was incompatible with their everyday experience of having a harmonious family. Sometimes family members found it difficult to answer the questions or to find the right language to do so. For example, to talk about the donor or genetic imbalance in their family, or about the effect of children on parents. The effect of parents on children is what we call parenting. But the reverse, however very tangible, is something that we have no words for, and something many family members had not thought about or discussed prior to the study. An exception was families with a child with disability, who were more used to thinking about the effect of the child on the family. Talking science may very well differ from talking family. And finally, there is undeniably some influence from my own little story, my own prejudices, beliefs, and cultural biases. So some self-reflection is in order in an attempt to face up the power imbalances and neutralize them as much as possible. So I'm a cisgender, heterosexual, European middle-class woman, coming from a warm, loving tradition of family. For a long time, I dreamed of having the same. So I had a fairy tale marriage, 2 years later a son, and 2 years later a divorce. As a single mother, I then adopted 2 sons from Haiti. And a decade later, I met my current partner. My epitaph could be something like first children, then a house, then a husband, and everything consistently second-hand. So now I live in this discourse-dependent family, diverse in race and ethnicity. My disability is, disability. My disability is really not limited to my foot, but not in gender. I'm the only woman and take on all the associated gender roles in a very traditional way. I am also somewhat socialized in the step-parent and more recently also in the step-grandparent narrative. And I experience my family as completely normal, healthy. You will understand that this all makes research totally unnecessary. Through autoethnography, my family guarantees me data and lived experiences for another 10 careers. Okay, so let me give you some ontology of our results. Okay, this is the kind of designs we all used. Here are the results. I chose the grand narrative, blood is thicker than water. I promised you to speak about blood a lot, because it's a very salient one that is also strongly rooted in Western culture. Its social expectations and standards dictate that a nuclear family is a family par excellence, in which children are socialized by their parents and blood ties spontaneously and automatically imply mutual love. They further imply that there is no escape from this family, for the parent-child relationship is involuntary and inseparably linked to genetic kinship. Let us widen our scope by looking at some alternatives based on our analysis of the small stories of families that are not all completely genetically related to each other. They have to deal with a genetic imbalance that requires quite a bit of relational work, of doing family and talking family. We will talk about stories of lesbian couples and children, transgender men with their cisgender partner, fathers and stepfathers in blended families and their children, parents and children in donor-conceived families, and parents and children in adoptive families. A common theme in all our studies was a sense of being different and equal at the same time. That is, within the family, the everyday experience of parents and children is that their family is indeed harmonious and complete, and thus similar to how they expect other normal families to be. It is only when they are confronted with the outside world that their otherness becomes clear. For example, the confrontation of lesbian couples with heteronormative traditions such as Father's Day or Mother's Day. They try to be normal and adapt. For instance, by reserving Mother's Day for the genetic mother and looking for a meaningful way to celebrate Father's Day. One couple said that their son's teacher had crossed the word dad in a poem for Father's Day and written mum on top of it. You should expect more from a school than just crossing that and replacing it by mom, wouldn't you? But the lesbian parents did not want to go against this. But it was a kind of confrontation of not being normal with the outside world. Another example comes from adoptees who are often asked where they come from, whether their biological parents are still alive, and if so, whether they have met them. These are such private questions that many of us would not consider them appropriate from a colleague or from a stranger on the street. But for the adoptees, it's a daily reality, and many of them answer willingly time after time. Our research on visibility management among gay and lesbian adults shows that they do regulate how much of their sexual orientation they reveal at work, at least in part to limit stigma and marginalization. For the same reasons, parents sometimes keep donor conceptions a secret. But then they are confronted with medical narratives and resemblance talk, and then they feel different. In many cases, the otherness cannot be hidden, such as for lesbian parents at school or the adoptees in the street. To avoid having to justify, they then conform as much as possible to the ground narrative. They experience that the outside world sees any deviation from the ground narrative as permitted, but also as a choice and as a responsibility. Anything goes, but you shouldn't complain afterwards. In the pursuit of social justice, this is by no means the family, it is by no means the family who must change in order to become less different. On the contrary, it's the institution, it's the school, the work context, or the society at large that is supposed to change. Social justice lies precisely in removing or improving oppressive conditions and addressing inequality. The reality of being different and equal at the same time leads, as expected, to a lot of relational work that becomes visible through inconsistencies in the family's narratives, in their stories. We found many examples of family members who minimized genetics but found it relevant at the same time. Parents say almost unequivocally that genetics is not important to them. While a few minutes later in the interview they would say, for instance, they would express a strong preference for using the same sperm donor for subsequent conceptions in order to establish real relationships between the siblings. Or they would say they spend extra time with the donor child because they have something to catch up on. Or they tell that the non-genetic mother in the lesbian couple carries the baby more often when they go for a walk, or gives the bottle, or changes the nappies more often, because they want to go the extra mile, because the natural bond is missing after all. In our study on sibling egg donation, a couple discussed that, so it's a sister who donates the egg to the other sister, and a couple discussed that because they had used the egg of the wife's sister, the genetic link was undeniable. And the mother said, because this was my sister's egg, so I think the genetic link, and then the father says, is there. And the mother says, yes, it's there. Maybe not 100%, but 99%. In the same vein, families often say that the donor plays no role in their lives. The donor is just something they got from the hospital. For instance, a seed, or a syringe, or an ingredient. One man said, if you make a cake, and then you need milk, and you need butter, and you need eggs, then afterwards you don't, if you present the cake to the people you invite, they don't ask you, where does the milk come from? Does it come from the less or the little? Yeah? So it's just an ingredient, and no one has to ask us where it comes from. Yeah? So that's not important, the donor. But then, a few minutes later, they talk about a specific characteristic of the child, such as red hair or a talent for dancing. And then they say he got it from his father, being the donor. So within minutes, they refer to the donor as completely unimportant and like a father. Interestingly, when the word father or dad was used, in many cases they quickly correct themselves by finding another word, as if it were like a slip of the tongue. They would then call them the donor, for instance, our little Dane. In Flemish, a lot of the donors are Danish. Or our garden angel. They alternate between erasing the donor and bringing him to the fore all the time. In fact, the words they use to refer to the donor are very diverse and depends on the specific social function. I told you about the social function of language. And about the social function Talking Family fulfills, and whether they want to position the donor in relation to the nuclear family or secure the role of the non-genetic partner or clarify the family structure or present a positive image of the donor or whatever. The same applies to children. In lesbian families, for instance, they struggle with the question of how to name their mother, the biological mother and the other mother, and the donor. They often use the heteronormative terms mom and dad, but this complicates matters. As their parents, this is the result of the conflict between the donor's role as progenitor and the absence of a social relationship. So it's clear, as I have already emphasized, that the inconsistencies in the little stories are by no means due to the narrators, but arise from the contradiction with the grand narrative. They are the narrator's attempts to deal with the dialectical tension resulting from the grand narrative and from being similar and different at the same time, and to reinvent their conceptions of family in order to adapt them to their unique story. Because what the discursive dependent families want ultimately is what most of, if not all, families want: acting in the best interest of the child and maintaining good relationships. This is the context in which they deal with the shared understanding of social and genetic parenting in their daily lives. Sometimes this means that they hesitate to talk about the genetic imbalance at all. A lesbian couple told us that their son asked how they decided who the genetic mother would be. How did you do that? How did they decide who the genetic mother would be? The parents considered this a silly question and not a starting point to start talking about the donor conception. In the interview they had said, no, he never has asked anything about the donor. It is not a topic. And then they say this, and during the interview they realized, he might have asked questions after all. Also, about half of the transgender men and their cisgender partners said that they intend to disclose the partner's transgender identity. Only half. And about 3/4 the use of donor sperm to their future child. Actually, we did also very interesting research that we asked parents before the conception whether they will tell the donor about the donor to their children or not, and then we asked them 12 years later, and the correlation was 0. Sometimes they said, no, we will never tell about that because the family and things and that, and then they had this there was one story where they had a boy with how do you call it, something between his teeth, and he resembled the prime minister at that time, Verhofstadt, and they were always joking, oh, the donor must be Guy Verhofstadt, yeah? So beforehand they said, we will never tell about it because, you know, the father, he was a bit, and then sometimes they said, of course, we are a very open family, we will talk about the donor, and then they tell such stories, well, we haven't talked about it because it never came up. And then when they start telling, then you see that, of course, this child has asked many questions, but then they say, oh, but this is a silly question. Another, and at first sight, paradoxical way of acting in the best interest of the child and remaining good relationships is going against the social expectation and standards that dictate the family members support each other and, if not, undertake the relational work necessary to get along better. That's something very strong in the grand narrative, that you have to get along in the family. sometimes parents and children take distance in their family as a sign of love. A certain degree of letting go of each other, often temporary, for example in blended families, can bring relief. An example comes from a biological father in our step-family research. He said, "Our weekends look like in standard families. Driving the kids to sports club, the youth movement, friends' birthday parties, and so on. Like other families, if we have the time, we do something together as a family in the weekend. But it also happens that I do something with my children and that she does something with hers. That way, now and then, we disconnect to create a bit of peace and to maintain our own family routines." So letting go of each other as a sign of love. Similarly, it can be positive and healthy when a parent and a child agree to respect each other, but not to invest in each other for a while. One adolescent living in a stepfamily said, "My stepmother and I, we are opposites. She smokes a packet of cigarettes a day and goes tanning every week. And I'm not like that at all. But my father is happy with her and I'm glad about that. We live in the same house, but we don't invest in each other. Sometimes we say hello to each other when we meet, sometimes we don't. I respect that she is there. It's good like that." It is not that uncommon for parents and children to become more estranged from each other, albeit temporarily, in nuclear families. But this is often accompanied by feelings of guilt and pain. Bringing these stories out into the open can ensure that this no longer has to be a taboo or necessarily negative issue. The same goes for the forced nature of the parent-child relationship. The possibilities of how family members relate to each other could be much more diverse and richer if more alternative stories could be told. However, it's equally important to recognize that distance in families can also be a reaction to an unhealthy situation. Families are not only a source of love, they can also be a place of oppression and conflict. We found, for instance, that ex-partners reported on average 5 to 6 incidents of unwanted pursuit, and that 10% of our population-based study on intimate partner violence experienced physical violence, and more than 50% psychological violence. Similar findings were found in a Turkish ethnic minorities sample. We also found that sexual minority men were more likely to be exposed to abuse and bullying in childhood and report more depressive symptoms in adulthood. Oppression and inequality do occur in families and have serious negative consequences. The ground narrative and its standards that family relationships are non-voluntary leaves no room for an appropriate detached response to inequality, abuse of power, or conflict. In such unhealthy family situations, the status quo cannot be tolerated. Our research on divorce and children has shown, for instance, that children have difficulty dealing with family conflict. To divorce is to stop something that does not longer work. In this sense, it can be very healthy and a healthy reaction to an unhealthy conflict situation if it creates a less conflictive family environment. Understanding family relations as chosen, voluntary, and less obligatory provides opportunities for family members to respond in a more balanced way. It is of great importance that these alternative narratives no longer remain untold, but are given a voice. Tonight, we talked family. We talked the grand narratives, we talked the little ones. And when I was putting the finishing touches to this text yesterday, I realized that in hanging my story on the difference between the two, I had been much more dualistic and categorical than you can expect from a person who wants to be anti-categorical. The two types of stories are clearly interwoven, as are our family identities, whether cisgender, transgender, blended, disabled, donor, nuclear, adopted, or whatever. That the mythical standards of the grand narrative puts pressure on or even suppresses the little story from discourse-dependent families became, I hope, clear. That the little stories also have the power to enrich the grand narratives is just as clear to me. This is where I differ a bit from the feminist critique of the ideology of love that mainly emphasizes oppression. There is so much love and care in the little stories that I think they cannot help but spill over into the grand narratives. That is why I want to argue for love and care as forces, not only within family, but also in the wider world. And that is why I am also convinced that it is important for all of us that as many little stories as possible can be told. Until the lions have a voice, the glory of the hunt will always be the tale of the hunter. I thought this proverb that I borrowed from the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe perfectly articulated what I was trying to say tonight. If even the king of animals does not get his story told, what can we expect from the discourse-dependent families? But change can start anywhere. For example, here with us. To give everyone the agency to be seen as they want to be seen, to do it their way. Let us give this story a happy ending. Let us be the voice of the lion.